I'm Bob Short, and this is Salute to Georgia's First Ladies, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest today is Shirley Miller, the wife of former Georgia Lieutenant Governor, and United States Senator Zell Miller. Shirley, welcome to our program.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bob.
You grew up in North Carolina.
Right. About 30 miles from here in Young Harris, in a little cove called Rail Cove out from Andrews, North Carolina.
Well, tell us about your early days in Rail Cove.
Well, I know now that it was a very, very isolated place. At the time, I didn't know that it was, isolated. I had a younger brother and a younger sister, and a great-grandfather who lived with us until his death when I was a child, and other neighbors who had kids to play with. So now I know that I was living in a very, very isolated existence, but I didn't know it at the time.
So you got to Young Harris by coming to Young Harris College.
Yes, I did.
And tell us about your days here.
Well, I like many Young Harris College alumni, just fell in love with the place, and still am till this day. It's a very, it was then, and I think it still is, a very special place that the students who come here either like it very, very much, or they don't stay very long. It's a close-knit community. And
it was here that you met your husband.
Right. Well, I knew who Zell was from seeing him on the campus, and though he didn't really know me. But the first time that we ever really spent any time together, we ran into each other at a square dance over in Andrews. And Zell has liked to tell the story through the years that he asked me if I would like to go. It was early in the evening. If I would like to go with him to another square dance that was going on not too far away, and where of course my daddy was not standing on the sidelines watching us, and so I checked it out with him, and then I told Zell, well, I got to take my truck home. Of course, I had to go ask my mama if that was going to be all right with her too. So Zell followed me from downtown Andrews up to Rail Cove, and he has told the story through the years that he didn't really know where he was going following this pickup truck, and especially when I had to ford a creek to get to the house. But so that was the first time we spent any time together. He knew that I was a student here at the college, and shortly afterwards, he joined the Marine Corps. That was just a month or so before he joined the Marine Corps. Good.
Before we get too far away, tell us about your dad.
Well, my dad was did some law enforcement work through his life, and he also did a lot of heavy construction work, and a lot of that was all done away from home. So he was in the Army, and we lived at Fort Bragg, and came back home from Fort Bragg when I was 10 years old, when the war was over. It wasn't too long before we came back home, and it wasn't long after that we had electricity to come to Rail Cove. And so then we really started farming, and it was a small working hillside Appalachian farm. We had chickens, and we had laying eggs, and to take care of. We had cows and calves and grew corn and tobacco and just the things that you do on a farm. And my daddy kind of knew what we were supposed to do, and when he would be away, if he was away doing construction work somewhere, my mama carried on, and so that was the kind of life that we lived there.
He was
producing, about everything that we needed.
He was sheriff of Cherokee County, as I recall.
Mm-hmm. When I was at Young Harris. I was at Young Harris College.
So you were introduced to politics at a rather early age.
Yes, and even before then, my family they were always interested in politics and following candidates and working for candidates, and so they were very politically oriented family.
So you had met Zell Miller at Young Harris College, and he joined the Marines.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It wasn't long after that, was it, that you two were married?
We were married, and then when I graduated from Young Harris College in 1954, we moved to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. So our first years were spent at Camp Lejeune.
What was it like being a Marine wife?
Well, by the time I was a Marine wife, the Korean War was over, and so that was a great relief that Zell would not be going to Korea like we had thought was going to happen earlier, and so. Until our first child came along, which Murphy was born while Zell was in the Marine Corps, and then Matt, our second child, was born the month that he got out of the Marine Corps. And so before we had a child, I worked and knew a lot of Marine wives that became friends, and we lived right outside the main gate to the base in a place called Midway Park.
And then came the University of Georgia.
Right. We moved to Athens just a few weeks before Zell was scheduled to get out of the Marine Corps because of the Matt was going to come along pretty soon, and as it turned out, Matt was born the same month that Zell got out of the Marine Corps. So we were in Athens then from August of 1956 to 1959. And Zell went to school, and he worked, and he tutored football players, and then later he had a teaching assistantship. And I took care of babies and typed papers for other students while we were in Athens. Uh-huh. But loved being in Athens. And still do. Just love going to Athens. It was a great place to live. So
following his graduation, he came back to Young Harris?
Yes. He had received his master's degree, and then the president of Young Harris College offered him a history teaching position at the college in, I guess, the fall of 1959, and so we came back and moved into a house on the campus.
And that was when he was mayor?
He was mayor, yes, he was mayor. Soon thereafter, he was mayor of Young Harris.
And then long about 1960, he decides to run for the state senate.
Right, he did.
And I know you remember that campaign.
Oh yes, I guess you always have very, very clear memories of the first one. Mm-hmm. Well, of all of them, but especially of that one. And he was elected on April the 30th. I remember the date. It was an early primary. of that year. I think Dr. Clegg had given him, who was president of Young Harris College, had given him permission to run for the Senate, and the deal was that he would teach a heavier load fall quarter and spring quarter, and also teach summer school, so he could be gone during the winter to serve in the legislature, and which he did. And when we first came home, I worked for a while for the Towns County Board of Education, and then I went to work at the Bank of Hiawassee, and I fell in love with being a worker in a bank, and
well, you had quite a banking career. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Well, after Zell served 2 terms in the state Senate, he ran for Congress and didn't win. And so he worked for 3 governors in a row. He worked for Governor Sanders, he worked for Governor Maddox, he worked for President Carter. And so at the time that he was working for Governor Maddox, the boys, Murphy and Matt, were about ready to go to high school. And so we made the decision that we would that they would go to school in Atlanta, and so that they would be where they would see their dad, not just on the weekends, but all the time. And so we went to Atlanta, and I began working at what was then C&S Bank, which is, of course, a part of Nations Bank now. And my first place of work was the bank in Buckhead. And I went there and went into the loan teller department. And so I was there for a good while, and then I was the head teller at that bank. And so I really enjoyed doing the work. And of course the kids were growing up, and the folks at the bank were very, very good to me. Every time I would say, you know, that I need to work fewer hours so I can do this, drive carpools, and so they, you know, the answer was, well, go drive your carpools and come back. And so that's what I did. And then after I had been there for a while, I was asked to go over to Decatur with another person who was working at Buckhead and a couple more people. So 4 of us went over to downtown Decatur to start the bank had been granted a national bank charter to start a bank in Decatur. And that was quite an experience, but going from Buckhead, where you work from can to can't every day, and it was just a very, very intense work atmosphere with lots and lots of people all day long every day. You know, starting from scratch in Decatur, which was a wonderful atmosphere, because some of the stores closed for lunch, some of the businesses closed for lunch, and it was just a very wonderful. The business community was so cohesive there, and everybody knew each other, and it sort of had a small town atmosphere, and so it was a good place to be. And so I was there in in a temporary building, and then we were in our new quarters right off the square, and so the bank was up and going, and so then they asked me if how would I like to go over to Cheshire Bridge and work at a bank that had not been open very long, but kind of help to grow that bank. and of course that was a completely different atmosphere, being in a what was a very old established neighborhood, along with the junior varsity and Happy Herman's, and other restaurants and food. You know that area, and so we were never hungry at the Cheshire Bridge branch of the bank, because so many of our customers were retail, in the retail food business, and so we did very well. But by the time that Zell was running for and elected lieutenant governor, they had once again told me that they'd like for me to go back to Buckhead. And so I was back at Buckhead during the first lieutenant governor's campaign.
Let's talk about that campaign for a minute. Were you very active in that campaign?
Well, as active as I could be with, Zell was not working and I was, but I have memories of on New Year's Eve of that campaign year, that we were in underground Atlanta handing out cards on New Year's Eve. That first lieutenant governor's campaign.
So he was elected lieutenant governor. Now, did you continue to work while he served as lieutenant governor?
I worked for a little while, and Zell's mother became sick, and so I had some other kinds of responsibilities that I needed to see about. And as you know, this house that we're in right now is the house that Zell's mama built when he was an infant, shortly after his daddy died. And we've been here for now almost 50 years. And so during the it became apparent to me that I needed more flexibility than I could have being a banker, that it wasn't fair to my customers, it wasn't fair to the bank, it wasn't fair to me and the family, that I needed to, it was just not something that I could do to be a banker. When you come in to close a loan or do some banking business, you expect your banker to be there, not your stack of paperwork on somebody else's desk. And so I left the bank, and for a period of years, I did some retail clothing stores. I had one in Hiawassee and Norcross, and one on the Buford Highway, and that was something that gave me a lot of flexibility in my time, that I didn't have to be there. If I needed to be in Young Harris, I could be here. And then in the early 1980s, I started helping organize a bank in Hiawassee, and which we opened in 1984, and I worked there until shortly before Zell was inaugurated governor. And I mean shortly, like I left at the first of the year before the inauguration.
And he was lieutenant governor for 16 years, which
And
I'm sure will always be a record.
Well, he enjoyed that. He enjoyed the legislative process very much, and
after that period of time,
of course, the boys grew up during that period of time that he was lieutenant governor, and of course Murphy went to Emory and then to law school, and Matt graduated from the University of Georgia, and so the boys grew up during the lieutenant governor years.
And then the big event was his race for governor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I know you two are very close. Was there much discussion about that decision?
There was some discussion about it that went on over a period of years. You know that old saying, the timing is everything in politics, and I think that we both thought that the timing was right. If he was ever going to run for governor, that was the time.
So he was elected, and you move into the governor's mansion. Tell us about life in the governor's mansion.
Well, it's hard. Living in the governor's mansion was new, but the area of the city was not new to me because I had worked in Buckhead for such a long time. You know, I knew where. I knew doctors, I knew dentists, I knew the pharmacist, the dry cleaners, the grocery stores, and so it was not a strange environment to me. But I guess we did the normal traditional things that had been going on at the mansion, the public tours and the other events, and then the rest of what we did pretty much evolved around the administration's agenda, which Zell, it was a very ambitious agenda. He had run with several different things that he really wanted to accomplish, and of course the beginning part of that would have to be the emphasis on education and improving education, and he had conceived of the hope was his baby. He planned how it was going to work, and he named it, and so the Hope scholarships and the pre-K and was at the very top of the administration's agenda. And so early on, in fact, in his first State of the State, and we had talked about it a lot beforehand, that where I would fit into that work, that I wanted to work with adult literacy. It was something that had touched me through the years, because when I was young and working, I would run into people that I just knew that could not write and could not read, but then I found the same thing in the different locations where I worked in Atlanta, that I had customers that I would, maybe had been with me for a long time, and all of a sudden I would say, initial the line where it says so and so, initial that, and then I'd get this blank stare, and then I would realize he or she can't read. They don't know where that line. They can't find that line because they can't read it, and so it was something that had. So I would have to, point it out, and I would always try to mark everything with little tabs where I would need initials, but sometimes I didn't have time to do that, and so it was something that had really touched me, and I realized that it was not just the area that I came from, but that it was a universal problem of people not being able to to read. So Zell signed me on in his first State of the State to work on adult literacy, and so that was my niche, and and I did it for 8 years, and very few days at the mansion I did not spend some of my time working on adult literacy.
How did you organize that? Was it through the school system? The object was to get a GED.
A GED.
Right.
And see, Hope has a, and I think even to this day, the piece of Hope that applies to technical schools is not as widely known as the scholarship part of it, but it's certainly as meaningful, I think, because Hope pays the tuition for students in the technical, they're now technical colleges, that are working on a certificate or a licensing program. And then, of course, the GED part is, and that's who was in charge of adult education, is the department that manages the technical institute. And when a person would receive their GED, they would get a $500 Hope voucher that they could use to further their education, to go into a job skill learning program. And of course, it was working with adult literacy was just lots of times just the greatest, because there's nothing like a GED graduation. So many times the people receiving the GEDs were maybe the first person in a family who had ever finished high school. And so extended families came, and they were always very, very happy events.
Mm-hmm.
So I did as many of them as I could. The graduation ceremonies, all over the state, just as many as I could. And former chancellor of the university system, Vernon Crawford, had a lifetime interest in literacy. And he had put together, along with help from especially Gene Bowen over at the University of Georgia, a program called the Certified Literate Community Program. And that is a program ongoing to this day, and where a community, a county, or will make a commitment to reach the point where that they are a literate community. And now I believe there are 21 counties who have received the status of being certified literate community programs, who've gone through the whole process and that they meet the criteria that they are literate communities, and one city. And the participating counties now, statewide, there's 53 that are still in the process, and one city. And so pushing this program and getting counties to sign on, getting county commissioners and the county school boards to agree to participate in the Certified Literate Community Program was a part of what I did. And it has been so successful, and I'm not sure of the statistics that I'm exactly right, but I think the number of annual GEDs went at that time from somewhere in the neighborhood of 13,000 to about 20,000 per year. And between 1990 and 1998, when Zell left office, there had been over 150,000 GEDs granted statewide during that time.
This might surprise you, but I looked it up, and it's 199,000.
Oh, is it that high? Oh,
Yes,
okay.
according to the latest figures that I could find, and that's quite an accomplishment.
Well, I guess I remember maybe the latest figures that we had at the time,
Yeah.
Along about that time. So that's great. That's great. It was almost hit that 200,000
Almost.
mark.
You also did work with mental health and cancer,
Yes.
and as a matter of fact, President Carter put you on a national committee on mental retardation.
Yes, I served during the Carter administration on the President's Commission on Mental Retardation. Mm-hmm. And that work, so that was during Zell's lieutenant governor days, I guess. Yeah. And part of the time I wasn't working at the bank. I had already left when I worked on that, but it was, of course, with members from all over the country, and mostly our duty was to examine programs that were working, in what states were various programs working, and to try to encourage other states to adopt what was working in particular states. And then we had some trips and meetings in places that were having problems. At that time, one of the big problems was up in Poughkeepsie, New York, and we went there and stayed and listened to the city fathers tell us about their problems that they were having with sort of a lot of people who had, with the new medications that were available, who had been able to leave institutions but had no place to go. And so we worked on those kinds of problems during that time.
Back to life at the mansion. Give us a typical day as First Lady. With
what I was doing with literacy and other things, you mentioned one of the things that is ongoing now, that every time I see a commercial that I'm very, very proud of, is I worked with Jean Young, Andy Young's wife, Jean, to help get started the Buddy Check 2 program for breast cancer, and it's still ongoing. You see commercials on having a buddy and breast self-examination that I've worked on with Jean, and but a typical day would be, Zell's getting gone to work, so they usually started pretty early. I was very, very fortunate when we went to Atlanta that Beverly Messer, who had been with me at the bank in Hiawassee from the very beginning of the organizing of the bank, went with us to Atlanta. And so she was always to work early. And so Bev and I would work early in the morning in an office that we shared on what we had to do and what was coming up. And then if it was a public tour day, then we had the morning with the volunteers coming in, the docents to do the public tours. And then after they were over, I usually tried to get together the mansion staff folks at lunch, and we would talk about what we needed to do and what we had coming up that we were planning for, and spend a while putting that together. And lots of times in the afternoons we would have groups of elderly folks come, sometimes handicapped folks, and sometimes groups of children who had handicapped children that to come to have a tour of the mansion. And then it would be dependent on whether we had an event that night or not, how long the day was, and how busy it was. Mm-hmm. Most of the things, well, we did a lot. We tried to support, the business community and the arts community, the different parts of the Woodruff Arts Center, and I was very interested in that, and worked and served on that board while we were in Atlanta. So we did things for the museum and for the symphony, and then for organizations around the state that we could in that area. But then a lot of the events were tied to the administration's agenda, because Zell wanted to, he wanted to work on the education projects, and then of course another big piece was he wanted to make the state safer, and with the two strikes law. And then one that we were really involved in was the economic development part of it. And so a lot of the events that we had to do with promoting Georgia, both within and without, and outside. And this required a lot of work, a lot of travel. It was a very fortunate time for us, though, because and Zell has this belief that if he could get this person or these people who were considering locating in Georgia or expanding in Georgia, if he could sit down with them and look them in the eye, that he could convince them that Georgia was the place to come. And so there was a lot of effort put in that area. And I think, as best I remember, the job creation over the administration was like 620,000. So that averaged creating 2,000 jobs a week during that period of time. So that was a big piece of the administration's agenda. And then he was very he wanted to set aside natural areas. So we had this program. We had two programs. We had Preservation 2000 going on, which was to set aside 100,000 acres of land that would be preserved for future generations to use. And then after that came the River Care program, and so that was another area that we were working on very diligently during that time.
You were First Lady during the Olympics.
Yes.
I bet that was a busy time.
Sometimes I think back that the Olympics ate us up for about 18 months. In the planning and the preparation for the Olympics was very, very time consuming, because we had responsibility for I felt like doing everything right. And so these people, the IOC, the Olympic Committee, things were going on about the Olympics long with us, long before the Olympics began. And of course the IOC, the Olympic Committee people, were from all over the world. And so the care and the planning that we had to do in order to serve the right food, not serve anything that was not acceptable in their countries, took a lot of care in planning and in the preparation to get it right, to do that. And of course we had support from the State Department, and we had wonderful support from the Coca-Cola Company, because the Coca-Cola Company, operates all over the world, and so they have people who knew the protocol and what we should do. So we had them right there in town that we could, and they were very willing to help us and to get ready. But the mansion being located where it is, we could not have trash pickup during the Olympics, and we couldn't have deliveries of the normal truckloads of food coming into that area of the city, because the security was very, very tight. So we borrowed the refrigerated parts of tractor trailers and parked them, and we had food stored in them prior to the Olympics that we were going to use during that time. And I think we had tents up for 6 weeks with the Olympics and the Special Olympics afterwards. And so when we would empty, as soon as we emptied a refrigerated trailer, then we had a place to store the garbage until it was over. And so I guess a real always has amused me incident during that time. At the beginning, we had we knew that the Clinton family was coming and would be there, and but we didn't know that a lot of the cabinet would be there at the beginning of the Olympics, and would also be there. So we didn't quite have the number right on who we were expected to feed for the beginning ceremonies night. And so many of the cabinet members came that day as well, and most of them brought clothes to go to the events that night. And so we didn't have enough food there to feed all of these people supper, and it was getting close to supper time. And the building authority people, the folks who operate the cafeterias and the restaurants for the Capitol normally, they were the folks who prepared the food for all the security people that had been brought in from all over the state to help with Olympic security. And so I called the folks down at the building authority and say, what have you got that you can spare for us? And so they told me and what they had, that they were sure that they had plenty of, that we could have some of. And so that's what we served the members of the that's what we served for dinner that night. So the president's cabinet had the same dinner that the security folks had, that that night. And of course, many of them had brought business attire to wear, and it'd been a hot day and they had been busy all day. And so we were sort of allocating where different folks could take a shower in the house. And then all of a sudden I realized we don't have this many towels. And so I called out to the troopers' barracks and said, I need to borrow every dry towel you have. And so in just a few minutes, I saw this laundry cart coming across the driveway with towels. And so I took it in the elevator, and I handed out the troopers' towels to the cabinet so they could take a shower to go to before they went down to the events.
Did you and Bev handle all this, or did you get a little extra staff during the Olympics?
We had our volunteers really helped. I mean, they went way beyond the call of duty to help us during the Olympics, and so did the Zell's staff from down at the Capitol. They came out and they helped us. All of them that didn't have other responsibilities that they had to do, they came and helped us. And of course that wasn't the only time that we called on them to come out and give us a hand, but they really did help us during the Olympics. And of course, being there when the president was there, they were folks that their Social Security numbers had already been run through. The Secret Service had already run their Social Security numbers because they had been there to help us with events previously, and so that's who helped us.
How do you treat a sitting president when he's your guest? Do you sit around and shoot the bull, or do you take him places, or playing country music?
Well, of course, President Clinton had visited us before he became president, and Zell stayed up with him. He's a night owl, and so Zell would just stay up and talk to him. And I guess the first time he came after he was elected president. He was on his way to South America, so he brought quite a group with him at that time that would go on with him on that trip.
And they stayed at the mansion also?
Well, yes, they stayed there. They stayed there too. The doctor, the military people, and of course they put in their phone lines. They put in their all that. It's quite a production to get ready to have a president stay with you because of the way the house sits with the windows upstairs across the guest room, the presidential suite and the Carter bedroom and the aides room being across the front of the house. So they have to bring in these huge pieces of bulletproof glass to put behind the windows. So getting ready for them to come is quite a production. And of course they bring the dogs and to go through everything and all that. But the first time that he was there after being president, a Navy cook came with him. They brought all of these pans that they were going to cook, and they brought all this food, and the pantry was full of all of their stuff. And then the president comes down and says, "What's Eva cooking?" And then I'm going to eat what Eva's cooking. And so none of what they had brought with them ever came out of the pantry, and the Navy cook visited and I think learned how to cook some Southern food.
How did you deal with security? Did you feel like you were pinched in, or did you feel comfortable or safe, or when you went shopping, for example?
Well, I felt I felt fine with them. I mean, I didn't have any problem with them, a lot of times when I would go out shopping or go out from the mansion, I would especially be out and about with grandchildren visiting, and I would I would take them along, and so I felt just fine with them. They were always very, very helpful, and got along very, very well with all of them.
Well, Governor Miller finishes his second term, and he comes back to Young Harris. But he didn't stay all that long.
No. He came time he I think we came back home pretty much feeling like that he had accomplished what he set out to do as governor. One of the things that he had wanted to do when he was lieutenant governor and had not been able to, and then at the end, close to the end of the governor's term, was able to do, was to take the state sales tax off groceries. And so we came home pretty much having, through the list of objectives, pretty well having addressed them. So he immediately started teaching at Emory. He did some teaching over at the University of Georgia. He taught some here at Young Harris College, and so we were pretty well settled in, and I was still unpacking from all of those many years and going through and sorting things that especially things that needed to that we had not sent to the Russell Library, and then unfortunately Senator Coverdale's death in July of 2000, and then Governor Barnes came up here and talked to Zell about going to the Senate, and he went out the door and said, I don't have a plan B. And so we talked about it, and then at breakfast I said to Zell, well, isn't this what you do? Isn't this what you do? And so he called Governor Barnes and accepted the appointment. And then, of course, we had a race, an election in November, shortly thereafter, where Zell ran just months.
And you were by his side the entire time.
So he said initially to me that I'm not going to do that partisan stuff in Washington, and I knew that was he was not going to do that, because he believes, and so do I, that there's a time to run and then there's a time to serve, and and after the election is over, until it's time for another one, that you've been elected to to be of service to your home folks. And so we went off to Washington, and were very fortunate to find a place to live up on Capitol Hill, just right across the street from Zell's office. So this was really the first time in his political career where I had followed what was going on a daily basis, because I was right there. And I guess to think about our time in Washington, we'd have to give you just a little bit of background about Zell's friendship with President Bush. The Council of State Governments has what they call the New Governor's School that happens within, second week after you're elected governor, that they have somewhere. And they ask people to be faculty. They ask sitting governors and their spouses to be faculty for the New Governor's School. So they had asked us to be faculty for the New Governor's School when President Bush was elected governor of Texas. And at that time, Zell and the president, they just kind of hit it off. Zell is a walking encyclopedia of baseball stories and statistics, and he's loved it and he follows it all season. And so he found with the president, they sort of hit it, became close friends through having mutual interests. And before he was sworn in as president, the president had asked Zell to come out to Austin and talk to him about education. And of course he was knowledgeable about what had happened in Georgia in education during Zell's administration. And so they became close friends, and out of that friendship came and Zell's belief in cutting taxes. Of course, he had two other tax cuts during his administration that were significant, in addition to the tax off of groceries. And so that Zell became the co-author of the Bush tax cuts.
Tell us, if you will, a little bit about the social life of a senator and his wife in Washington.
Well, I think one of the surprising things to me about Washington, about the Senate, was that there is a whole lot less social life than you normally think is going to happen there. The work day at the Senate is I think is very different than the perception of it, in that a lot of time during the day they spend in committees, and so they actually get down to the legislative work pretty late in the day, and many times work late into the evenings. And so a lot of times they will not adjourn until 9 o'clock, or people who watch C-SPAN, too, know that 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, they'll be voting, along into the evenings. And many times, if Zell was, if there was some delegation from Georgia there, someone would take Zell to the front of wherever the event was taking place. He would go in and say a few words, come back out and get in the car and go back to the office. So that, and I guess I, like many Americans, I think, probably think that, that there's a lot of social life in Washington for the members, but certainly not on the Senate side, and I don't think on the House side either. The Senate wives have been chapter of the American Red Cross for a long time, a very long time. And every Tuesday, the Senate wives get together and have lunch, and all those who want to, and the business of the lunch is if we're working on a something for the Red Cross, and that mostly is blood drives. There's a lot of young, healthy people on Capitol Hill that you can have very, very successful American Red Cross blood drives, and all the wives are. All you have to do is to recruit them and make them some cookies, and then go help with the blood drives on the days that you have them. And so that happens every Tuesday, and then in the afternoon the Senate chaplain meets with all the Senate wives who want to meet with him and have a Bible study kind of an afternoon session with him. And I attended that. There were other Senate wives there on both sides of the aisle whose husbands had been governors same time that Zell was, that we had known through the years. So there were some people that wives that I already knew very well and had for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And then I was also a member of one of the international clubs, International Club Number 2, and which are they have a long history as well, and these are organizations of women whose of wives from the diplomatic corps, some who have wives whose husbands have been in politics in other administrations who are still there, and members of Congress, the House and the Senate wives. And we would have lunches, and if we went to an embassy, learn a lot of detail about the country that the member was from, and then there were a few business wives in Washington who were part of those groups. So I found those to be very enjoyable, and plus learning a lot from those meetings.
Did you and Senator Miller associate much with other senators and their wives socially?
We did not a whole lot, because there was just no time to do it. Mm-hmm. We spent more time, I guess, socially with other senators and wives when we went on a trip. One time we went on a trip with a group to Mexico, and we spent time with them. Then we went on a trip, then we went to Normandy for the 60th anniversary of D-Day with a group. And so we spent more time with them socially on trips. But of course, you really do it on a daily basis, because you never know who's going to, what wives and husbands are going to be having lunch together, and then you run into people at the Capitol and spend some time. So you spend enough time that you know a good bit about their families and what's going on there. But I think wives spend more time together without the husbands, because it is a heavy workload that the members of the Senate do.
A lot of travel involved in being a United States Senator.
not the kind of travel like being a governor. You know, we did a little bit, and as of course Zell and Jim Bunning made a trip to Iraq. No wives, they made a trip to Senator Jim Bunning from Kentucky, and Zell went to Iraq on a trip. Of course, wives didn't go on that, but it wasn't the kind of travel that I was used to as being a governor's wife, where we would do an economic Department of Industry and Trade travel trip every spring. You know, a long trip to Europe in the spring, and a trip to the Far East in the fall during all those governor years.
But there is a lot of travel back and forth between.
Oh, between home and yes, and seems like everybody does it. The only wives that I knew that didn't do a lot of traveling were those with small children who had children, young enough children that they were still taking care of kids in Washington.
Mm-hmm. But you and Zell traveled a good bit.
Yes,
almost every weekend.
Almost every weekend. Mm-hmm.
Right,
and that's pretty much standard. Especially for people on the East Coast, and amazingly, for us it was very, very easy. You left Washington and you came to Atlanta, and then you got in a car and you came home. But many members would have to, change planes somewhere, and then have a lot longer distances to go from wherever they left an airplane to where they lived than we did, and it still did a lot of traveling.
Did you enjoy your time in Washington?
Yes, I did. I think that there was just something. So of course, everything was pretty close. We didn't keep a car there because there wasn't anywhere to put a car. And so I had a little grocery basket that I would take to the dry cleaners and to the grocery store and around the neighborhood. And so when I would start back to the apartment, there's just something about seeing that Capitol dome that is just, that when you realize, you think about the country. And seeing the Washington Monument lit up at night, or seeing, or going by and seeing the Jefferson Monument, or President Lincoln, or the FDR Memorial. It's just that when we would have friends or family that would be there, that I would be showing them around, and going to the Library of Congress and showing them the room that has Thomas Jefferson's library in it. Those things are very, I found to be very, very heartwarming, and make you proud to be an American.
Did you regret Senator Miller's decision not to seek re-election?
No, I did not. I think we were both ready to come home.
Speak to us a little bit about his being an author.
Well, I guess I can't really leave the Washington part of our lives without just saying a word or two about his speech at the Republican National Convention, because they had asked him to speak at the convention, and initially he did not know that it was going to be the keynote, and so he had written out, he had written, and of course that's the author part too. He had written a speech, and then later they told him that they wanted his speech to be the keynote. And the day of the keynote, he was, of course, still working on it. And then realizing that the vice president was going to come after him, he didn't want to get into any of his time because the networks would cut it off if the vice president didn't have all of the time that he was supposed to have. So Zell was still cutting on that speech, you know, just a few minutes before he went up on the podium to deliver it. So he was still chopping on it, and initially he was afraid that what he had left of the speech was not a speech that was going to be helpful to President Bush. But after we had been home a day or two, and we were hearing back from people on their campaign trail, telling how well, whenever it was mentioned out on the trail, that it was being received, that, you know, that those fears left. But he did do 2 books shortly, you know, thereafter, A National Party No More and A Deficit of Decency, which both of them were, you know, were very well received.
Bestsellers.
Both of them were on the New York Times bestseller list. Mm-hmm. But of course, Zell has always written. He wrote whenever we first met. He writes. He always has. He has always written, all the time. Even now, he comes in from walking Gus, and sometimes he hasn't carried paper and pencil with him, and he'll come in, and I can tell when he comes in the back door that he's looking for a piece of paper and a pencil to write down whatever he has on his mind that he wants to put on paper.
Well, we might mention he also keynoted the Democratic convention. Mm-hmm. With a good speech
in 1992. Mm-hmm.
Right, and that was well received also.
Yes. So I guess he's the only person who has keynoted both. I think now Senator Lieberman has spoken at both, mm-hmm. but I guess Zell is the only person who has keynoted both the Democratic and the Republican national conventions.
Looking back over your husband's career, what has made you most proud?
Well, there are several things that I think that have been really important contributions, but I think probably the Hope Scholarships. Not too long ago, we went down to Georgia State University to take part in the celebration of the millionth Hope Scholarship that has been granted. So I would have to say that probably what the Hope Scholarships have meant has been the thing that I have been most proud of. Mm-hmm. And of course, now you know, Zell is one of 3 Georgians who has been elected both governor and United States senator, and I think that that's really quite personally that is really a quite an honor. And of course, that, you know, I realize that that would not have been possible if it were not for the men and women who, you know, the very able, productive men and women who have worked for him and with him over this this long political career, and of course they're just like extended family to us. We keep track of their careers. We like to hear from them, like to know about what's going on with their families, and that they really deserve a lot of the credit for what things that he was able to accomplish in political office. And then you know, our family's always been supportive. Our, you know, our boys helping with campaigns when they could, and we just been so richly blessed. Matt and Katie live here, and so does Murphy and Susan, and they have the four grandchildren, Asia and Justin and Andrew and Brian. And now of our 6 great-grandchildren, Asia has 4. She has Jacob and Joshua, Mary Elizabeth, and baby Braylon. And Justin has 2, Jasmine and Jordan. And Andrew is a sophomore at Augusta State University in Augusta, and Brian is a sophomore here at Young Harris College. And so we have the good Lord has been very, very good to the Millers, and has blessed us with a wonderful family, and all of these good folks that have helped Zell during his political career.
Turtle on a fence post.
He didn't get there by itself.
That's right. I guess he'll always be known for that.
All right.
So, I'd like to add, though, that Murphy is now Superior Court judge,
Right.
and doing well, I hear.
He has this Enota circuit, which is Towns, Union, White, and Lumpkin counties.
Mm-hmm. And Matt is a banker.
Yes, he is.
So both of your boys are successful also. Well, Shirley Miller, it's been a great pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you for coming to Young Harris.
And I would like to thank you on behalf of the Russell Library, the University of Georgia, and myself for being our guest.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.